Hook. The entire graduation ceremony stopped when military police grabbed an old man by the arm and dragged him away from the gate. He didn't fight. He didn't argue. He just let them pull him, his worn canvas bag swinging against his hip, his eyes fixed on something in the distance that nobody else could see. The families watching from the bleachers went quiet. The drill sergeants froze. And then Command Sergeant Major Adrian Cross, a man who had never broken formation in 31 years of service, stepped off the parade field and walked toward the commotion with an expression on his face that nobody at Fort Daxton had ever seen before. Not anger, not confusion. Something much closer to shame. This story already has you leaning forward. Stay with me until the very end. Hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning had started the way most late October mornings started at Fort Daxton, Wyoming, cold, flat, and unforgiving, with a gray sky pressing down on the parade field like a lid on a pot that was already starting to boil. The mountains to the west were invisible behind cloud cover. The wind moved in short, sharp gusts that snapped the flags into rigid lines and pulled at the collars of dress uniforms. Emily Hale stood at the back of the formation with 19 other graduates of the military medical training program, her hands clasped at the small of her back, her posture so precise it looked mechanical. She was 34 years old, which made her the second oldest person in her cohort, a fact that had been mentioned to her sometimes directly, sometimes in the form of raised eyebrows, more times than she had bothered counting. She was also the only graduate who had arrived at the program already certified as a civilian trauma nurse with 11 years of field experience. Fact had been mentioned significantly less. To most of the people around her, she was simply the quiet one, the one who didn't socialize much in the barracks, the one who sat alone in the mess hall reading clinical manuals, the one who asked questions during medical briefings that the supervising officers occasionally had to look up before they could answer. None of that had earned her any particular warmth from her peers, most of whom were 10 years younger, 3 ranks higher in ambition, and completely certain they already knew everything they needed to know. She didn't hold it against them. She'd spent 11 years in a civilian trauma center, being underestimated by people who confused confidence with competence. She knew exactly how that story went, and she knew how to wait it out. That morning, standing in the Wyoming cold with dress shoes that pinched her left heel and a graduation cover that sat slightly too low on her forehead, Emily was not thinking about any of that. She was scanning the visitor area. He had called 3 days ago to tell her he was coming. Walter Hale, 78 years old, retired from everything, currently living in the house in rural Montana where Emily had grown up. He'd said it simply, the way he said most things. I'll be there, Emmy. Don't argue with me about the drive. She hadn't argued. She'd just confirmed the gate visitor protocol and left his name with base administration. What she hadn't done, what she was regretting now, standing at attention with no ability to move, was arrange for someone to meet him at the entrance. The visitor area was filling up. Parents in good coats, spouses with strollers, a few older veterans who sat straight even in folding chairs. Emily ran her eyes across the crowd twice, 3 times, looking for her grandfather's particular silhouette, the slight forward lean, the canvas bag he carried everywhere, the white hair that he refused to cut past a certain length. She didn't find him. She told herself he was probably still parking. She told herself the traffic on the access road was likely backed up. She told herself a lot of reasonable things, while the knot in her stomach told her something different. Walter Hale had parked without difficulty. He had driven 11 hours from Montana over 2 days, stopping overnight in Billings the way he always did when he made this kind of trip, because he was 78 and he respected his own limits even when other people underestimated them. He arrived at the Fort Daxton main gate at 8:45 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, which he considered adequate margin. He was wearing his good clothes, a pressed gray shirt, dark trousers, the boots he kept polished, even though he no longer had any official reason to keep them that way. Canvas bag on his shoulder held a camera he'd borrowed from a neighbor, a folded program he'd printed from the base website, and a small framed photograph he'd brought for Emily. Nothing about his appearance was unusual. Nothing about his demeanor was threatening. The gate was staffed by 3 personnel. 2 of them were occupied with the vehicle line. The third was Staff Sergeant Marcus Vale, 29 years old, 8 months into his current posting, and not having a particularly good morning. He'd been assigned gate duty instead of the ceremony detail he'd requested, and his irritation was sitting just below the surface of his professional face, not quite invisible. Walter approached the pedestrian entrance, gave his name, and waited. Vale looked at the visitor list, looked at Walter, looked at the list again. Hale, he said. Walter Hale. I'm here for Specialist Emily Hale's graduation. Vale made a show of scrolling through the list on his tablet. The name was there. Emily had confirmed it. But the way Vale was looking at the screen, he was doing something other than finding it. Deciding something. You got a base access pass, he said. I was told I'd receive a visitor badge at the gate, Walter said. My granddaughter submitted my information to administration. Administration processes take time. You got any military ID? I'm retired. I don't carry an active military ID. Vale set the tablet down and looked Walter over again. The way a person looks at something they've already decided doesn't belong where it is. Sir, without a valid visitor pass or military identification, I can't authorize access. Walter kept his voice level. He had spent decades keeping his voice level in situations that warranted considerably more than the irritation currently on offer. Can you check with base administration? The name should be in the system. Administration's running the ceremony today. They're not taking calls. Vale gestured toward a line of plastic chairs set up on the far side of the parking lot, separated from the main visitor flow by a temporary barrier. Can put you in the overflow area while we sort it out. You'll be able to hear the ceremony from there. The overflow area, Walter repeated. It's for visitors whose access hasn't been confirmed. My access was confirmed 3 days ago. Sir, I drove 11 hours to be at this graduation. Walter's voice didn't rise. It didn't harden. It simply became more present, the way a room gets quieter when something important is said in it. My granddaughter is graduating today. She submitted my name to administration herself. Vale looked at the 2 other gate personnel, neither of whom was paying attention, and then back at Walter. The decision was already made. It had been made the moment Vale looked up from his tablet and saw an old man with a worn bag and no laminated pass. Sir, I need you to move to the overflow area, or I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises. Those are your options. A family with 3 children pushed through the gate beside them, waving a printed visitor confirmation. Vale waved them through without a second look. Walter stood still for a moment. He was looking at Vale with an expression that was not anger. It was something quieter than that, and more patient, and in its patience there was something that might have been sorrow. Then he nodded once and walked toward the overflow area, because making a scene at a military gate was not something he was going to do today, not when Emily was about to receive something she had earned. He sat down on a plastic chair, set his bag on his knees. Listened to the ceremony music starting up in the distance. Inside the ceremony grounds, Emily had still not spotted him. The formation had begun to move toward the parade field, and she moved with it, because there was nothing else to do. She told herself again that he was probably in the visitor stands, in a seat she simply couldn't see from her angle. Kept her eyes forward and her hands steady and told herself that too. What she couldn't tell herself out of existence was the growing awareness that something had gone wrong. The ceremony began with a formal march-in, the national anthem, and remarks from Base Commanding Officer Colonel Darren Shepard, a compact man with a graying crew cut who spoke briefly and without particular warmth about duty, commitment, and the medical corps' role in force readiness. Emily stood at attention through all of it and heard very little. Her attention kept sliding sideways to the visitor stands. The first row of stands was visible from her position in the formation. She could see the first 4 or 5 rows clearly enough to make out faces. Walter Hale's face was not among them, she breathed. She straightened her spine, an additional fraction. She waited. 40 yards away, on the other side of the barrier, and out of sight from the parade field, her grandfather sat in a plastic chair in the overflow area with 2 other confused visitors, a teenager who appeared to have the wrong date on his phone, and a young woman with a sleeping infant who was quietly furious in the way. Only a person who has been directed to a folding chair when they should be in a proper seat can be furious. Walter did not complain. He pulled the folded program from his bag, found Emily's name, and ran his thumb across the printed letters. Then he put the program away, straightened in the chair the same way he'd straightened in considerably worse seats in considerably worse conditions, and listened to Colonel Shepard's voice carrying faintly over the barrier. What he didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that the overflow area had been positioned directly downwind of the vehicle staging area, and that the maintenance crew had parked a diesel generator there for the ceremony's PA system. The generator's exhaust was blowing directly across the overflow seating. Teenager with the wrong date had already noticed the fumes and moved as far back as he could go. The woman with the infant had pulled the stroller's shade down and was looking around with increasing alarm. Walter noticed the exhaust smell immediately. He had spent enough time around field equipment to know exactly what he was breathing in, and he knew that the infant in the stroller was going to have a problem before the adults did. He stood up, walked to the young woman with the stroller, and said quietly, "That generator's running rich." The fumes are going to concentrate here. You should move the baby back toward the parking lot. There's enough distance from the barrier that you'll still hear the ceremony." The young woman looked at him. "Excuse me? The exhaust. It's not safe for the baby this close. I'm not trying to alarm you. I'm telling you because you should know." She hesitated for 3 seconds, the amount of time it takes a person to decide whether a stranger is being helpful or intrusive, and then something in his voice convinced her. She moved the stroller. 20 minutes later, when a second generator kicked on, and the fume concentration in the overflow area increased significantly, the teenager also moved back. The 3 chairs where they had been sitting were noticeably worse than anywhere else in the space. Walter remained in his seat, slightly downwind but managing it, watching the gap in the barrier through which he could see a sliver of the parade field. Emily's name was called at 10:47 in the morning. She walked to the front of the formation, received her certification, shook Colonel Shepard's hand, and walked back to her position. The applause from the stands was polite, in general the kind of applause that covers a full-class graduation without distinguishing between individuals. She looked at the visitor stands one more time as she returned to formation. The seat where she had been hoping to see her grandfather's white hair and gray shirt was occupied by a woman in a blue coat who had been there since the ceremony started. Emily faced forward. She did not allow her expression to change. After the ceremony, the formation was dismissed, and graduates moved into the visitor area to find their families. Emily walked with purpose toward the main gate, because if Walter wasn't in the stands, then either something had gone wrong at the gate or he hadn't made it, and she needed to know which. She had almost reached the gate when she heard a voice she recognized. It was Sergeant First Class Donna Reyes, the NCO who ran administrative coordination for the medical training program mid-40s, efficient, the kind of person who filed everything in triplicate and never lost a piece of paper. She was standing near the gate control booth, talking to Staff Sergeant Vale with the flat, precise tone of someone who was not yelling, but was making very clear she wished she could. Should have been on the confirmed list. The entry was submitted through the correct portal 3 days ago. Portal confirmation didn't push to my tablet, Vale said. That's a system problem, Sergeant, not a visitor problem. Where did you put him? Overflow. Emily stopped walking. Reyes said, "You put a confirmed visitor in the overflow area during the graduation ceremony." "I didn't have confirmation on. He's been sitting in the overflow area for 2 hours. Reyes's voice didn't get louder. It got very, very quiet during the ceremony. In the diesel exhaust zone from the generator staging. Emily was already moving past them both. Pushed through the gate, Vale didn't stop her, possibly because he recognized her rank. Possibly because something in her face told him not to try and walk quickly across the parking lot to the overflow area. Walter was still in his chair. He was sitting straight, the canvas bag on his knees, watching the gap in the barrier. Color was fine. He was breathing normally. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and his face did something just briefly, just for a moment that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite relief. It was more complicated than either of those things. "Emmy," he said. She crossed the distance between them and put her hand on his shoulder. Not a hug, not yet. Not here in the middle of the parking lot with people watching. Just her hand on his shoulder, steady. "How long have you been here?" she said. "Since about 8:45. She did the math. 2 hours and 15 minutes in a plastic chair in a diesel exhaust zone, while his granddaughter received her certification 40 yards away. She kept her voice, even because he was watching her face, and she didn't want to show him how angry she was. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Emmy." The fumes were a bit much closer to the generator, but I moved the young woman with the baby before it got serious. She was grateful. Emily looked at him for a moment. Of all the things he had just said, the one that hit her hardest was that he had spent his 2 hours of unjust confinement making sure someone else's child was safe. Pressed her hand on his shoulder once and said, "Let's get you into the ceremony grounds. The reception is still running." "I don't need the reception." "I do," she said. "I need you there." He stood up, picked up his bag, straightened his gray shirt, and walked beside her back through the gate that had turned him away 2 hours earlier. Staff Sergeant Vale was still at the gate control booth. He didn't say anything as they passed. Walter didn't look at him. Emily did. She held the look for exactly 2 seconds, the amount of time required to communicate something clearly without making it an incident, and then she looked away and kept walking. The reception was held in the base community center, a large open room with folding tables and trays of food that had been sitting out long enough to be technically room temperature. Emily brought Walter a cup of coffee and a plate and found them 2 chairs against the wall, away from the main traffic. He ate without complaint. He complimented the coffee, which was not particularly good. He asked her questions about the program, how the final assessment had gone, what her first posting was going to be, whether she'd made any friends in the cohort. She answered all of it, watching his face, cataloging the things she always cataloged when she saw him after a long absence. A slight deepening of the lines around his eyes, the way he held his coffee cup in both hands the way he always had. Particular quality of his attention when she was speaking, which was absolute and unhurried in a way she had never found in anyone else. It was during that conversation Walter, asking her about the field medicine component of the program, Emily explaining the trauma simulation exercises, that a man crossed the room toward them. She noticed him because of the way other people moved around him. He was in his late 50s, dress uniform, command sergeant major's rank, and he moved through the reception crowd with the particular economy of motion that comes from 30-plus years of military posture, becoming something you simply inhabit rather than perform. Emily had seen the command sergeant major at the ceremony, but hadn't interacted with him. His name, according to the program, was Adrian Cross. He was not heading toward her. He was heading toward Walter. Emily saw it first because she was watching the room, and Walter was watching her. She saw Cross's pace slow as he got closer, as if some part of his brain was catching up to something his eyes had registered earlier. She saw his expression shift not dramatically, but in the way that a person's face shifts when a memory surfaces that they hadn't expected. Cross stopped 6 feet from their chairs. He was looking at Walter with the kind of focus that precedes certainty. Walter turned. He registered Cross's rank, his expression, the particular way the man was standing. Something moved across Walter's face, old and familiar and careful. "Cross," said Walter Hale. He didn't say it as a question. Walter set down his coffee cup, Sergeant Major. "You were at Kendra Station," Cross said. 94. Field medical post in the northern corridor. The room around them hadn't changed. People were still moving, still talking, still filling plates at the food tables. But Emily felt the space around their 3 chairs tighten into something different. "I was," Walter said. Cross was quiet for a long moment. He was looking at Walter the way people look at something they'd thought was gone permanently. "Private first class," he said. "Mortar fragmentation. Northern corridor, June of that year. They told me afterward that the medic who kept pressure on my leg for 4 hours in a field position while the medevac was grounded was listed as a casualty. They had me write a statement about it." He paused. "I wrote the statement. Nothing happened." Emily had gone very still. Walter said, "You didn't need to carry that. I carried it anyway." Cross looked at the canvas bag beside Walter's chair, then back up at his face. "They gave you no recognition for what happened in that corridor. Tried to correct it through channels. The paperwork kept disappearing." "It was a long time ago," Walter said. "It was," Cross agreed. "But you're here now." He looked at Emily, then back at Walter. "She's yours?" "My granddaughter," Walter said. "She graduated this morning." Cross nodded slowly. He looked at Emily with an expression that had recalibrated significantly from the distant, professional look of a senior NCO observing a junior graduate. "Your grandfather," he said, "kept 4 wounded soldiers alive for 6 hours in a position that had no business being held. He did it without resupply, without reinforcement, and after taking a hit himself that should have put him down." He paused again. "When I finally had rank enough to push for a proper review, the records office said his service file had gaps. Administrative error. That's what they called it." Emily looked at Walter. Walter was looking at his coffee cup. "I moved the young woman's baby," he said quietly, which made no sense as a response to what Cross had just said, and then Emily understood. He was deflecting. The same way he always deflected when someone tried to give him something he'd decided he didn't need. It was the most characteristic thing about him. Cross understood it too, apparently. He didn't push. He straightened slightly and said, "I'm going to need your information before you leave, mister. Hale, both of yours." He looked at Emily when he said the last part. "What happened this morning at the gate is going to be documented, and what happened in 19,994 is going to be reopened." He held Walter's eyes for another moment, the kind of moment that is actually a statement, and then nodded once and walked back across the room. The noise of the reception came back around them. Someone laughed near the food tables. Child ran past their chairs, chasing something invisible. Emily looked at her grandfather. He was still looking at where his coffee cup sat on the table, and his hands were flat on his knees, and he wasn't saying anything. "Grandpa," she said. "Eat your food, Emmy," he said. "Walter." He looked up at her. His eyes were dry. His expression was controlled with the particular precision of a person who has had decades of practice at this specific form of control. But underneath it, in the slight set of his jaw, in the way he'd flattened his hands on his knees to keep them, still was something that had weight and history and years of silence around it. "The records," she said. "What happened to them?" He was quiet for a long moment. Outside the community center windows, The Wyoming sky had shifted, the cloud cover breaking slightly, a thin line of pale light pressing through over the mountains to the west. Someone made a decision, he finally said, that some stories weren't worth keeping. Emily held that. She held all of it, the 2 hours in a plastic chair, the diesel exhaust, the gate sergeant's dismissal, the casual erasure of a man who had spent 4 hours keeping soldiers alive in a field position that should have killed him. She held it the way she had learned to hold difficult things, not by suppressing them, but by giving them the space they required and deciding what to do next. They're going to need documentation, she said. Your discharge papers. Any citations you kept. Letters, photographs, whatever you have. I know what documentation is, Emmy. I know you do. He looked at her again. Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile, but the thing that lives adjacent to a smile, in the territory of someone who raised a child and watched them become something worth raising. You're going to make trouble, he said. I'm going to make necessary inquiries, she said precisely. Walter picked up his coffee cup and took a sip. He didn't say anything else, but the line of his shoulders had changed very slightly, a fraction of the tension he'd been carrying, since the moment Vale had directed him toward a plastic chair had released, as if the day had finally offered him something he hadn't expected to receive. What neither of them knew, sitting there against the wall of the Fort Daxton Community Center while the reception wound down around them, was that Adrian Cross was already on his phone in the corridor, that he was calling someone in the records division of the Army Medical Department, that he was using a voice Emily would have recognized, quiet, certain, the voice of a person with rank and will and a very specific kind of patience, and saying 3 words that had not been said about Walter Hale in 32 years. Hold the file. And in the base administrative office, 300 yards from where Emily was sitting with her grandfather, a clerk named Pruitt, who had been processing routine paperwork all morning, looked up from her screen as the request came through, saw the rank of the person making the request, and immediately stopped doing everything else. Clerk Pruitt had been working in base administration for 6 years, and in 6 years she had processed approximately 40,000 pieces of routine paperwork. And in all of that time, she had received exactly 3 direct requests from a command sergeant major that arrived without the standard routing protocol. The first 2 had been personnel emergencies. This one, she understood immediately, was something else. Pulled the file, or rather she tried to. The Army Medical Department's records system, a patchwork of digitized archives and legacy data that had been partially migrated twice in the last decade, and fully migrated, never returned a result that made her sit back in her chair and read the screen twice. Walter Hale. Service number confirmed. Records flagged. Partial archive. Primary documentation set. Pending audit. Secondary documentation set. Administrative hold. 1,997. Access restricted. Records Review Division, Washington. Stared at that for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called Cross's extension directly, which was not something junior administrative clerks typically did, but the situation seemed to require it. Cross answered on the second ring. She read him the screen, word for word. He was quiet for long enough that she checked to make sure the call was still connected. Administrative hold since 1997, he said. Yes, Sergeant Major. Who placed it? It doesn't show originating officer. The hold date and the division, another silence. Send me everything the system will release, whatever isn't locked. And I want the whole documentation, the form that authorized it. Whoever signed off. That exists somewhere. I'll find it, she said, because she would. She spent the next 2 hours doing exactly that, which meant she was still at her desk at 1,430 when the base medical officer came looking for Cross about something else entirely, and she overheard enough of that conversation through the thin wall of her office partition to understand that the afternoon was about to become considerably more complicated than the morning had been. Emily had walked Walter to his car at noon. She'd made him promise to stop in Billings again on the way back. Made him take the number for the base medical line in case the exhaust exposure caught up with him overnight. Stood in the parking lot watching his truck pull out with the particular feeling of watching someone leave when you're not sure of the terms under which they'll return. Not that Walter was frail, he was sharper than men 20 years younger, and his constitution had survived things that would have ended most people, but the image of him sitting alone in a plastic chair for 2 hours in the diesel zone was something she was going to be carrying for a while. She went back inside. She had a 1,300 appointment with Major Renata Okafor, the senior medical officer who oversaw the training program's graduates during their transition to base posting. Okafor had been one of the evaluators for Emily's final assessment, and Emily had noticed, without particular surprise, that Okafor's evaluation notes had been the most critical in the cohort, not of technical performance, which was unimpeachable, but of what Okafor had called integration deficit and resistance to unit protocol, which were phrases that could mean almost anything, and therefore meant, Emily understood, that Okafor didn't like something about her that was harder to name. The 1300 meeting was in Okafor's office, which was small and very organized. Okafor herself was 46, trim, with the kind of professional composure that had probably taken years to perfect and currently served as a wall rather than a manor. She gestured Emily to the chair across from her desk and got to it without preamble. "You completed the program," she said. "Your technical scores were in the top 5% of the cohort. Thank you, ma'am. That's not the concern." Okafor set a folder on the desk but didn't open it. Concern is placement. "You've been requested for the trauma unit at Daxton Medical, which is where your scores would normally land you. However, before I confirm that placement, I want to discuss your performance in the collaborative simulation exercises." Emily kept her hands flat on her thighs. "All right. In 3 of the 5 collaborative scenarios, you deviated from the designated treatment protocol. In 2 of those 3 cases, you made the decision independently without notifying the supervising officer. In both of those cases, the patient's presentation had changed from the scenario parameters," Emily said. "Following the original protocol would have been incorrect, given the updated presentation. Protocol exists for a reason, specialist. The protocol exists for the standard presentation of the injury type. When the presentation changes, the protocol has to flex with it. Not deviation, that's assessment." Okafor looked at her steadily. "The other graduates followed the designated protocol. 2 of the other graduates," Emily said, keeping her voice careful and level, "would have administered a vasopressor to a patient showing early signs of fluid overload. The sim had continued another 4 minutes. Protocol called for it. The patient presentation didn't support it." She paused. "I'm not saying I'm always right. I'm saying the protocol is a tool, not a ceiling." The silence in the office was the kind that has texture. Coffer picked up the folder, opened it, looked at something inside, and closed it again. "You have civilian trauma certification," she said. 11 years, yes ma'am. "Nothing in your file suggests you've worked in a military medical environment before this program." "That's correct." "Then I'd ask you to consider that 11 years of civilian trauma experience and 11 years of military trauma experience are not the same thing, and that the gap between them sometimes creates habits that are harder to identify than they are to have." Emily considered that for exactly as long as it deserved to be considered. "I'd agree with that," she said, "and I'd also say that 11 years of field trauma gave me the ability to read a patient presentation without the diagnosis being told to me first, which I think has value here." Okafor looked at her again. Whatever she was looking for, she either found it or decided to table to the search. "I'm going to confirm your placement at Daxton Medical," she said. "Trauma unit as requested, but you'll be on a 60-day evaluation period. Any further deviations from protocol that aren't immediately documented and reported to your supervising officer will result in a formal performance review." She closed the folder. "Do you understand the terms?" "Yes, ma'am." "Do you have any concerns you want on record?" Emily thought about the plastic chair, about 2 hours of diesel exhaust, about the words administrative hold, 1997. "Not at this time," she said. Okafor nodded. Meeting over, Emily stood, replaced her chair precisely, and walked out. In the corridor, she stopped and took one slow breath. Then she took out her phone and sent Walter a message. "Drive safe. Call me when you stop." Then she sent a second message to a number she'd been given. During the reception, Sergeant First Class Reyes, who had been the one to confront Vale at the gate. "When you have a moment, I'd like to know what documentation was filed on what happened this morning. Urgently. Just when you have it." Reyes responded in under 4 minutes. "Already filed. Cross requested a copy. You'll have access to it through your personnel portal by end of week." Emily put her phone away. She walked toward the trauma unit for her first official shift, and she did not let herself think yet about everything she'd learned in the last 8 hours, because thinking about all of it at once was not going to help anyone. She thought about it in pieces. The way she'd learned to process things in an ER, where the habit of compartmentalization was not a defense mechanism, but a survival tool. Piece 1. Her grandfather had been turned away from a military gate, despite being a confirmed visitor, directed to a diesel exhaust zone, and held there for over 2 hours. That was documentable, and would be documented. Piece 2. Cross had recognized Walter. Cross had named a specific action, a specific date, a specific result. That was not the kind of memory that gets invented. That was the kind of memory that gets carried. Piece 3. Walter's records had been placed on administrative hold in 1997 by someone for a reason, and that reason had kept a legitimate military record inaccessible for 29 years. She pushed through the trauma unit doors. The smell hit her first antiseptic, and the faint metallic undertone that never fully leaves a space where wounds get treated, and something in her body recognized it and settled. The way a person's posture changes when they walk into a room that is built for the thing they're good at. The charge nurse on the afternoon shift was a sergeant named Terry Bach, broad-shouldered and weathered, probably 50, who looked up when she came in and did the standard military assessment of her rank before deciding how to address her. Specialist Hale, you're the new placement. Yes, Sergeant. Graduation was this morning? Yes. Bach nodded at this without particular warmth. He handed her a tablet with the afternoon patient roster and said, "We've got 12 beds active. 3 are post-op recovery, which is straightforward. 4 are general medical. 5 are trauma holds from the training exercise yesterday, recruits from the combat medic course, assorted injuries from the obstacle course. 2 of the 5 are the ones to watch." He pulled up 2 patient files on the main monitor. Crute Vasquez, possible cervical sprain from the rappelling station. Crute Morrow, soft tissue damage, plus a concussion, hit his head on the water obstacle. Cleared by the field medic on scene, but his affect has been off since he came in, and I want a second read on him. Emily looked at Morrow's intake form. Field medic assessment from the training site. Vitals at intake, current status. She read it twice. What's his headache doing? Bach glanced at her. Stable. He says it's a 4. What does he say it was when he first came in? Also a 4. Did he actually say that, or did the intake nurse read a 4 from the scale card and he agreed with it? Bach was quiet for a moment. It was the kind of quiet that means someone is recalculating. I'll pull the intake recording, he said. I'll check on him, Emily said, before I do anything else. She went to Morrow's bed. He was 19, dark-haired, sitting up against his pillow with the particular stillness of someone whose head hurt more than they were saying. Emily pulled the curtain partially, introduced herself, sat in the chair beside the bed rather than standing over him, and talked to him the way she had learned to talk to patients who were under-reporting without the pressure of direct questions, moving around the edges of what she actually wanted to know until he filled in the gaps himself. It took 7 minutes. By the end of it, she had established that his headache had been a 7 when he arrived. The scale had been held up without explanation, and he'd pointed to the number he thought would get him released rather than held, that he was experiencing intermittent visual disturbance in his left peripheral field, and that he hadn't mentioned the visual disturbance because he'd assumed it was normal after a head impact. It was not normal. She went back to Bach. Morrow needs a neuroconsult. The visual disturbance is new left peripheral field, intermittent. He downgraded his own pain score at intake. I think the field medic clearance was premature. Bach looked at her for a moment. She could see him assembling something evaluating her, deciding how much weight to give a first-shift graduate with 0 days in the unit. Neuroconsultations require a senior medical officer's authorization, he said. I know, Emily said. Who's the senior medical officer in shift? Captain Adrian. He's in rounds. Can you pull him for a consult? Bach's expression did a complicated thing that resolved into a version of reluctant professionalism. I'll page him. Captain Adrian arrived 11 minutes later and was the kind of physician who walked into a room already slightly annoyed at having been paged. He was in his late 30s. Skilled Emily could tell that from the way he moved, but carrying the specific brand of impatience that sometimes grew in people who had been very good for a long time and had stopped being questioned. He looked at Morrow's chart, looked at the intake data, and looked at Emily. You're the new placement, he said. Yes, sir. You're requesting a neuroconsult on your first shift based on a patient self-report of visual disturbance. Yes, sir. Intermittent left peripheral field disruption, beginning within an hour of the impact. He downgraded his pain score at intake. I have that on the room recording. The field clearance was done in under 4 minutes. Aldrin looked at her for a moment that was slightly too long to be neutral. Then he went to Morrow's bedside himself. He was in there for 4 minutes. When he came out, his expression had reorganized. Order the consult, he said to Bach, and walked back toward rounds without looking at Emily again. Bach entered the order. He didn't say anything to Emily, but something in how he moved had shifted incrementally, barely perceptible, the way attitudes adjust when evidence refuses to cooperate with assumptions. Emily went back to the roster. She was on the 3rd patient file when Bach appeared at her elbow and said quietly, "Good catch." She didn't look up from the tablet. He would have mentioned the visual disturbance eventually. I just moved the timeline up. He might have gone home first. She turned a page on the file. Yeah, she said. That was the concern. The neuroconsult on Morrow came back within the hour. Mild epidural contusion, not severe, not requiring surgery, requiring 48-hour inpatient observation and imaging follow-up that would not have happened if he'd been released on the original field clearance. The neurologist, a civilian contractor who came in on a rotation schedule, gave Emily a look across the nursing station that she'd learned to read correctly over 11 years. The look of a specialist who has arrived because a nurse caught something the original assessment missed and is now deciding whether to acknowledge it or simply proceed as if the catch was incidental. This one acknowledged it, briefly. "Good flag," she said, and moved on to Morrow's room. Emily filed the documentation and moved on. She had learned early in her nursing career that waiting for credit to arrive was a losing game. The work was the work. The outcomes were the outcomes. If she spent the next 60 evaluation days doing the job she knew how to do, the file Okafor was assembling would eventually need to reflect what actually happened, regardless of what it had started out intending to say. What she had not planned for what disrupted the quiet arithmetic of that strategy was what happened at 1720, when she was completing her afternoon chart entries and Sergeant First Class Reyes appeared at the trauma unit door. Reyes was not in a good mood. She had the particular expression of someone who has spent an afternoon making phone calls and receiving answers she did not want. She gestured Emily into the corridor with a look that meant not in front of the patients. "Your grandfather's records," Reyes said, once the door was closed. "Cross has been working the channels since this morning. He got the partial file release, everything the system would hand over, without the Washington hold being lifted. I've seen part of it. And there's a citation in the partial release. A formal commendation that was submitted in 1994 written by the battalion commander, countersigned by 2 other officers. References the Kendra Station incident specifically. Keeps Walter Hale's name, his service number, the specific action in the northern corridor." Reyes paused. Commendation was submitted for formal approval. "There's a receipt for it in the system." Emily waited. "There's no approval," Reyes said. "No denial either. It just stops. The submission exists, the receipt exists, and then nothing. No processing record. No forwarding record. No record of it reaching the review board." She looked at Emily directly. "That doesn't happen by accident." Emily had known this in some formless way from the moment Cross had said administrative error with the tone of someone who did not believe that's what it was. But knowing something in a formless way and having it said aloud by someone with a personnel file in front of them were different experiences. Kept her voice steady. "Is Cross going to request a records audit?" "Already has. He submitted the formal request this afternoon." Reyes lowered her voice slightly, though there was no one in the corridor to hear her. "Problem is that a records audit at that level has to go through the Army Records Division in Washington, and the same office that has the hold on the file is the office that has to process the audit request." Emily understood that. "They'll sit on it, not necessarily. Cross has 3 decades and significant relationships. But it's not going to be fast, and it's not going to be clean. Someone in that chain made a decision in 1997, and people who make decisions like that tend to have insulated themselves." Reyes let that sit for a moment. "I'm telling you this because you should know what you're walking into. Whatever Cross started today, it doesn't end in a week." "I know," Emily said. "Does your grandfather know?" Emily thought about Walter's hands flat on his knees. The way he'd said, someone made a decision that some stories weren't worth keeping. Carefully controlled precision with which he had not allowed his expression to do anything in front of Cross that could be read as wanting something. "He knows more about this than either of us," she said. "He's known for 30 years. Reyes looked at her for a moment. "All right," she said. "I'll keep you informed on the gate incident documentation. Vale's being formally reviewed for the handling of a confirmed visitor. That one at least is straightforward." She left. Emily stood in the corridor for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, and then went back inside to finish her charts. Walter called at 1840. He was in Billings, at the same motel he always used, eating at the diner next door. He sounded fine. He sounded exactly like himself. She asked if he'd noticed any respiratory irritation from the exhaust, and he said, "No, Emmy, I've had worse," which she believed, but filed alongside everything else she was filing. She told him about the neurocatch not to change the subject, but because she actually wanted to tell him, because he was the person she called when something at work mattered. He asked 2 precise follow-up questions about the presenting symptoms that told her he had forgotten more about field neurology than most people in her cohort had learned. Then he asked how the meeting with the medical officer had gone. 50-day evaluation, she said, a short silence. "For what reason?" "Protocol deviation. I made independent assessments in the collaborative sims. Were the assessments correct? Yes. Then you'll be fine, he said, with the simple certainty of someone who has never confused being correct with being immediately recognized for it. Things take time. She wanted to say, that's what I'm afraid of. She said, I know, Grandpa. After she hung up, she sat in the break room for a few minutes with a cup of bad coffee and thought about the commendation that had been submitted and received, and then had simply ceased to exist in any processed form. She thought about the particular shape of that erasure, not a denial, which would have created a record but an absence, a receipt that led nowhere, a name that had passed through a system and come out the other side without the thing that should have followed it. Thought about who benefited from that absence, who in Wanzen, 997, had looked at a combat medic's commendation and decided that the least visible way to handle it was to handle nothing at all. She didn't have names yet, but she was beginning to understand the shape of what she was looking for. On the third day of her posting at Daxton Medical, something happened that had nothing to do with Walter's records and everything to do with the 60-day evaluation that was already sitting on her file like a shadow. It started with a mass casualty drill. Every major military installation ran them on a rotating schedule, simulated multi-patient scenarios designed to stress test the medical unit's response capacity. Daxton's drill was a Category B exercise, meaning it involved 20 simulated casualties, role players from the base training units, and a clock that started the moment the first patient crossed the threshold and did not stop until the last patient was either triaged, treated, and dispositioned, or the scenario was terminated. Emily knew about the drill. She had been briefed with the rest of the trauma unit staff. What she had not been told, what no one on the afternoon shift had apparently been told, was that the drill had been moved up by 90 minutes, which meant it was now starting during the shift transition period, when the morning crew was 3/4 out the door and the afternoon crew was still pulling on their gear. The first simulated patient came in at 1,313. Emily was still reading the morning handoff notes. For 40 seconds, there was a kind of organizational paralysis that happened specifically in the gap between preparation and reality, people reaching for clipboards that weren't there, looking for the senior officer who was supposed to be running the drill coordination, and finding that Captain Aldrin's vehicle was not in the parking lot because he had been called to a meeting off base that had run long, and he was currently on the highway 3 miles away. Bach took one look at the incoming patient flow and turned to the assembled afternoon shift. Aldrin's not here. I'm running primary. Someone pick up secondary triage. He looked at Emily without quite meaning to the involuntary look of a person whose eyes go to whoever they've decided is capable, and then caught himself. Emily was already moving. I've got secondary, she said, and did not wait for the discussion that Bach was clearly having internally. What followed was 47 minutes of organized chaos, which is the only kind of chaos that produces acceptable outcomes in a mass casualty scenario. Emily ran secondary triage with 2 corpsmen and a third-year nursing student who had frozen for a full 30 seconds at the sight of the first role player's simulated injuries before shaking herself back into function. Emily talked her through the first 3 patients in short, specific sentences, not to calm her, but because short, specific sentences were the information she needed to do her job. Student found her footing by patient 4 and held it for the rest of the drill. Problem came on patient 14. Patient 14 was a role player presenting with simulated blast injury shrapnel pattern on the left side, altered consciousness, mechanism consistent with close-range detonation. The scenario card designated him as a priority, too serious but stable, treatment within 30 to 60 minutes. Emily assessed him, read the scenario card, and read him again. His blood pressure was dropping. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would necessarily trigger immediate alarm for someone following the Priority 2 designation and expecting a stable presentation. The rate of decline over the 4 minutes since initial assessment, combined with the mechanism of injury and the specific distribution of the simulated wound pattern, indicated to Emily that Priority 2 was wrong. She reclassified him to Priority 1 without consulting Bach. She did it in under 10 seconds, called for the resources the reclassification required, and moved the patient to the primary treatment space. Noticed. He finished with the patient he was managing and came to her. What are you doing? 14 is a P2. His pressure dropped 6 points in 4 minutes, and the blast pattern puts the risk zone over the left iliac. If this were real, he'd be bleeding into his abdomen. The scenario card says P2. The scenario card was written before this patient's simulated presentation developed. She kept her hands moving, kept her eyes on the role player. In a real event, we'd reclassify based on developing presentation. I'm doing that. Bach was quiet for 2 seconds. She could feel him deciding. "We'll discuss this after the drill," he said, and went back to his patient. The drill ended at 1,400. Adrian arrived back on base at 1,403, having missed the entire thing, and received the summary from Bach while still in the parking lot. Emily was charting the drill documentation when she became aware that Adrian and Bach were in the corridor of Futsu's side, and that the conversation was loud enough to carry through the door. "She reclassified without authorization," Adrian said. She documented her reasoning. "The scenario card designates the patient's priority level. That's the point of the card. You can't just override the drill parameters. The drill parameters are designed to simulate realistic patient development. If the simulated presentation develops, the assessment should develop with it." Bach's voice had something in it. Emily hadn't heard from him before, not quite defense, but something close. She's 3 days into her first posting. She's already had one protocol flag in her evaluation file. The flag is from her training assessment. Her performance today. Her performance today created a documentation problem that I now have to explain to the drill evaluation board. Adrian lowered his voice slightly, though not enough. "I don't want to build a 60-day evaluation record on someone who makes unilateral decisions in high-pressure scenarios. That's not what I need in this unit. What you need," Bach said, his voice dropping too, "is someone who caught a concussion that was heading out the door. You want me to ignore that?" A pause. "That's not the same situation." "It is exactly the same situation," Bach said. She saw something developing that the paperwork didn't account for. Both times. Silence. "Then Adrian, I'll review the drill footage before I make any decisions about the evaluation note. This conversation doesn't change the protocol requirements." Footsteps moving away. Emily kept charting. Her handwriting did not change. Her heart rate was doing something she chose not to pay attention to. She was finishing the last documentation entry when the trauma unit doors opened, and a man she didn't recognize walked in. Not medical personnel, no uniform, civilian clothes, carrying a notebook rather than a tablet. He had the look of someone who had been in and around military bases, long enough to move through them without appearing to navigate, which was its own form of expertise. He looked at the nursing station, found Emily, and came directly to her. He introduced himself without preamble. Warren Gould, Army Inspector General's office. And he was there because a formal complaint had been filed regarding the handling of a confirmed visitor at the Fort Daxton main gate on the morning of October 23rd, and because a concurrent records audit request had been submitted by Command Sergeant Major Adrian Cross regarding a 1,994 service commendation that had been placed on administrative hold in 1,997 without documented authorization. He had questions for Emily. He said, questions for Command Sergeant Major Cross, who had requested that Emily be present when those questions were asked. Emily set down her pen. She looked at Gould for a moment, at his notebook, at the quiet professional readiness in his expression, the fact that someone from the Inspector General's office was standing in the trauma unit of Fort Daxton 3 days after a graduation ceremony, in a 2-hour plastic chair, and she felt something shift in the geometry of the situation. Not resolution, not yet. Something earlier than that, the moment when a locked door, after a very long time, finally begins to move. "When?" she said. "Tomorrow morning," Gould said. 0800. CSM Cross's office. He handed her a card. She looked at it. Then she looked up at him. "Did you pull the whole documentation yet?" "The form that authorized the 1,997 administrative hold on the file." Gould's expression did something careful and precise. "We found the form," he said. He looked at her for exactly 1 second longer than necessary before he answered. And in that second, Emily understood that whatever was on that form was not going to be simple, was not going to resolve quietly, and was not going to leave the people responsible for it with an easy exit. The officer who signed the hold authorization in 1,997, Gould said, retired as a colonel, currently a civilian contractor. He has an active contract with Fort Daxton. The trauma unit hummed around her. Somewhere behind the curtains, a monitor beeped its steady rhythm. Emily held Warren Gould's card in both hands and felt the full weight of what he'd just said settle into the room like something that had been waiting a long time to land. The name landed in the trauma unit and stayed there. Emily walked out of the building at 1,830 with Gould's card in her jacket pocket and a very specific kind of quiet in her head, not calm, but the functional equivalent of it, state she defaulted to when the information was too large to process in motion and needed to be held still until she could do something useful with it. The retired colonel, the active contract, the hold placed in 1,997 on a commendation submitted in 1994. 3 years between submission and burial, during which someone had apparently decided that a combat medic's recognition was a problem worth managing. She called Walter from the parking lot. He picked up on the third ring, still in Billings, finishing dinner. "There's a contractor on base," she said, without preamble, because he would not want preamble. "The Inspector General's office found the form that authorized the hold on your records. The officer who signed it in 1997 retired as a colonel, currently holding an active civilian contract at Fort Daxton." A silence on Walter's end, not the silence of surprise. The silence of a man who is hearing something confirmed that he had suspected for a long time and had never had the standing to say aloud. "Do they have a name?" he said. "Gould didn't give me one. He might not be able to at this stage. But they have the form." "They have the form," Emily said, "with a signature." Another silence. She could hear the ambient sound of the diner dishes, low conversation, a television somewhere. Walter said, "What time is the meeting tomorrow?" 0800. "Cross's office. Gould wants you there if you can make it." "I'll leave at 4, Walter said, which meant he was already decided, which she had known before she finished the sentence. "Don't argue with me about the drive." "I wasn't going to," she said. She hung up. She sat in her car for 4 minutes, doing nothing. Then she drove to base housing, ate something she didn't taste, and spent 2 hours reading everything she could find in the public record about Army Inspector General investigation procedures, the records audit process for pre-2000 service commendations, and the legal framework governing civilian contractor conduct at military installations. She was not a lawyer. She was not an investigator. But she had 11 years of reading patient charts in conditions that did not allow for uncertainty, and she had learned that the difference between understanding a situation and being managed by it was usually a question of how much of the underlying structure you could see. By midnight, she had a reasonable map of the structure. She also had a headache, which she treated with water and 2 ibuprofen, and not the 3rd ibuprofen she briefly considered, because she needed to sleep, and sleep required the headache to be manageable rather than gone. She slept 4 hours. It was enough. Cross's office was larger than she'd expected, not because of the room itself, which was standard military issue, but because of the absence of unnecessary things in it. A desk, 2 chairs, a filing cabinet, one framed photograph on the wall that she didn't have time to examine closely. The window looked out over the parade field. 7:55 on a gray October morning, the field was empty, and the mountains were still invisible, behind cloud cover, and the whole base had the particular hush of a place that was preparing for something without yet knowing what it was. Walter arrived at 7:58. He had driven 4 hours in the dark, and he looked precisely as he always looked, composed, correct, his gray shirt pressed, his boots polished. He did not look like a man who was about to sit in a room where 3 decades of someone else's decision-making was going to be laid on a table. He looked like a man who had made peace with difficult terrain a long time ago, and was now simply moving through it. Cross stood when Walter entered, not the standard acknowledgement stand of a senior NCO receiving a civilian, the full stand, the kind that means something. Walter shook his hand and sat down without making anything of it. Gould arrived at exactly 800, with a woman Emily hadn't met introduced as Special Agent Diane Farrow from the Criminal Investigation Division, which recalibrated the room significantly. CID did not attend Inspector General meetings as a routine matter. CID attended when the IG investigation had identified elements that crossed from administrative irregularity into something that had a different legal name. Emily noticed Cross noticed this. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. Farrow set a folder on the desk. She was in her 40s, efficient, with the particular economy of motion of someone who spent most of their professional time in rooms where every word was going to matter later. She looked at Walter first, then at Emily, then at Cross. "I'm going to lay out what we have," she said. "Then I have questions. Some of them will be for Mr. Hale, some for CSM Cross, and some for Specialist Hale. Any point you need to stop, say so. Go ahead," Walter said. Farrow opened the folder. In 1994, a formal commendation was submitted by Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Astor on behalf of Corporal Walter Hale, then serving as a combat medic with the 3rd Medical Battalion. Commendation cited specific actions during a 6-hour field engagement at Kendra Station in the Northern Corridor, including sustained treatment of 4 critically wounded soldiers under direct fire after sustaining a personal injury. Commendation was countersigned by 2 other senior officers and submitted through proper channels for formal recognition. She paused. In the system, there is a receipt confirming the commendation's arrival at the Records Review Division. There is no subsequent processing record. Walter said nothing. Cross was watching him. In 1997, Farrow continued, an administrative hold was placed on Corporal Hale's full service file. The hold was authorized by then Colonel Garrett Lund, serving at the time as Deputy Director of the Records Review Division. The hold cites, and I'm reading directly from the form, pending verification of field documentation accuracy. She looked up. There is no follow-up verification report. There is no resolution of the pending status. The hold was placed and the file was not accessed again through official channels until CSM Cross's audit request 3 days ago. Gould said, Mr. Hale, were you aware that a commendation had been submitted on your behalf in 1994? I was told it had been submitted, Walter said. I was never told it had been received. Did you ever attempt to follow up on its status? 3 times. In 1995, 1996, and 1998. Each time I was told the file was under review. He paused. After 1998, I stopped asking. The room was quiet. Emily was looking at her grandfather's hands. They were flat on his thighs still, Farrow said. Garrett Lund retired from active service in 2003. Currently holds a civilian consulting contract with Fort Daxton, managing procurement compliance for the base's medical supply chain. Contract was renewed most recently in March of this year. She closed the folder. We've also identified that Lund had a prior professional relationship with the battalion commander, whose unit was involved in the Kendra Station engagement. The nature of that relationship is currently under examination. Cross spoke for the first time since introductions. Kind of examination? Financial, Farrow said. That's what I'm not able to elaborate on at this stage. Emily felt the shape of it, assembling in her mind the commendation that disappeared, the hold placed 3 years later, the prior relationship, the financial thread. She did not say any of it aloud because Farrow was not finished. Mr. Hale, Farrow said, I need to ask you something directly, and I want you to know that your answer doesn't determine the direction of this investigation. The investigation is already moving, but it matters to the record. She held his eyes. Do you have any personal documentation of the Kendra Station engagement? Letters, photographs, any written record from that period that you retained independently of your official file? Walter looked at her for a moment. Then he reached down to the canvas bag he'd set beside his chair, opened the top flap, and pulled out a small bundle secured with a rubber band. He set it on Cross's desk. Inside the rubber band were 3 items. A folded letter on military stationery, its creases worn to near transparency. A 4x6 photograph, black and white, showing 4 men in a field position, one of them unmistakably a younger Walter Hale, crouched over a patient with the focused economy of motion. Emily had watched her whole life, and a small index card covered in handwriting she didn't recognize. The letter is from Lieutenant Colonel Astor, Walter said. He wrote it to me personally in late 1994, separate from the official commendation. The photograph was taken by a member of the unit. The card is a note from one of the soldiers I treated at Kendra. He sent it in 1995, after he'd been through recovery. He paused. Kept them, because they were mine. I didn't keep them for this. Farrow looked at the bundle for a long moment. Then she looked at Walter with an expression that was professional and contained, and underneath both of those things was something that had nothing to do with her job title. May I take these into evidence, she said. You may, Walter said. Farrow picked up the bundle carefully. Gould photographed each item before she secured them. The room was very quiet while this happened. Cross was still watching Walter. He had the expression of a man who has carried a piece of information for 30 years and is now watching someone else finally lift it. The meeting ran until 950. By the time Emily walked out of Cross's office, 3 things had happened that had not existed 90 minutes earlier. Lund's base access had been placed under a security review. His consulting contract had been flagged for suspension, pending the investigation's findings. And the original commendation, now reconstructed from Astor's personal letter, and corroborated by Cross's own 1994 witness statement, had been formally entered into the active records system with a pending review classification. That meant it existed now in a way it hadn't before. None of that was resolution. Emily understood that clearly. Resolution was months away, possibly longer. What had happened this morning was the mechanism of accountability engaging slowly, imperfectly, with friction at every joint, the way large institutional processes always moved when they were being asked to correct something they had originally been used to conceal. The file was open. The form was in evidence. and Garrett Lund was going to have a conversation with the Criminal Investigation Division that he had spent 29 years successfully avoiding. She had a shift starting at 1,100. She went. Bach was at the nursing station when she came in. He looked at her once, looked at the time, looked at her again. "Everything okay?" "Fine," she said. "Anything urgent on the roster?" He handed her the tablet. She read it while she tied her hair back. 3 of yesterday's drill casualties had been updated. Morrow's imaging had come back clean, consistent with the mild contusion diagnosis, and his observation stay was proceeding without incident. Good. The rest of the roster was stable. What was not on the roster, and what walked in at 1,140, was a situation nobody had anticipated. The call came from the training range, not a drill this time, not a scenario with role players and scenario cards. A live fire exercise had gone wrong in the way that live fire exercises occasionally went wrong, despite every protocol designed to prevent it. 2 recruits down. One with a fragment wound from a range accident. Mechanism unconfirmed, injury location reported as left shoulder and upper chest. The second with a fall injury. The recruit had gone down hard on the range deck when the incident occurred, and the field assessment was reporting possible fracture and a period of unconsciousness that no one had timed accurately because the range had been in controlled chaos for 4 minutes before anyone got to him. Daxton Medical was the closest facility. They were coming in hot. Bach did not hesitate. He had the unit running in 90 seconds this time, without the shift transition gap, without the missing senior officer, the morning crew still present, and the afternoon crew arriving early, because word traveled fast on a military base. Adrian was in the building. He took primary. Bach took secondary coordination. The unit assembled with the mechanical efficiency of people who had just done a drill and were now doing the actual thing. Emily was assigned to the second casualty, the fall injury, the possible fracture, the unclear loss of consciousness. She had a corpsman with her named Garrett, no relation to anything, just unfortunate timing of name, and the nursing student from the drill, whose name was Park, who had found her feet on day 1 and kept them. The ambulance came in at 1,203. The first casualty, the fragment wound, went to Aldrin's team. Emily's recruit was a young man named Olvera, 20 years old, ranger track candidate, who came off the stretcher conscious but not oriented, which was its own problem. Kept saying his shoulder was fine, which it was not, and asking if his sergeant was watching, which was the kind of question that told Emily his primary concern was not his own condition. "Sergeant's not in the room," she told him, which was true. "Just us. Tell me where it hurts." "My shoulder's fine," he said. "I believe you think that," she said, which was not agreement. She was already running hands across his shoulder and upper arm, feeling for the crepitus that would confirm the fracture the field report had flagged. She found it at the clavicle, the distinctive grinding give of broken bone under pressure. He inhaled sharply when she hit it. "There it is," she said, not unkindly. "Broken collarbone. It's not a complicated break, it happens, and it heals. I need you to stay still and let me check your head." "I didn't hit my head. You lost consciousness on the range. I just went down. I didn't—" He stopped. His eyes did something, a brief involuntary flutter, just for a second, that she caught, because she was watching for exactly that. "Garrett," she said to the corpsman, "get me a neurocheck. Start with pupils." His GCS, I know what the field GCS was. Get me pupils. Garrett moved. Park was already positioning the light. Olvera's left pupil was sluggish, not dramatically, not the blown pupil of a severe bleed, but sluggish in the way that warranted immediate imaging and did not warrant waiting to see if it resolved. Emily was already reaching for the call button when Aldrin appeared at the curtain, stabilized his patient faster than expected, and had come over to check the second casualty status. He looked at Olvera, looked at Emily's hands, looked at the position Garrett and Park were in. "What are you seeing?" he said. "Sluggish left pupil." He had a loss of consciousness on the range that was untimed. The field report called it a fall injury, but if he went down during the incident rather than because of it, the mechanism is different. She kept her eyes on Olvera while she talked. "I want a CT." Aldrin moved to the other side of the bed. He looked at Olvera's eyes himself. He held the light. It took 12 seconds, which was a long time to take when someone else had already told you what they were seeing. "Order the CT," he said. Park moved to the station to place the order. Aldrin stayed at the bedside. He was looking at Olvera with the focused clinical attention that Emily had seen flickers of before and recognized as the part of him that had gotten very good at this, before whatever had calcified around it. He adjusted the head, positioning himself carefully, the way someone does when they want to make sure it's done right and don't entirely trust that they can say that without it being taken the wrong way. Emily did not say anything. She did not make anything of it. She moved to where she needed to be and continued doing what needed doing. Olvera's CT was back in 41 minutes. Small subdural hematoma, left side, consistent with the pupil presentation. Not large. Not immediately surgical. But not something that would have been caught if his loss of consciousness had been attributed to the fall alone and he'd been cleared on the field GCS and sent to rest. The neurology team was paged. Olvera trimmed a neurology observation. He was going to be fine, that was the early read. Qualified appropriately. Not certain yet, but fine, in a way that required the next 72 hours to confirm. Emily was writing up the documentation when Adrian stopped at her workstation. She was aware of him before he spoke, because she had learned in 4 days to be aware of when he was moving toward her. Good catch, he said. It was the same phrase Bach had used 3 days ago. This time, it landed differently, not because the words were different, but because of what it cost him to say them, which was visible in the slight tension around his jaw and the way he'd positioned himself slightly too far from the workstation, as if he hadn't fully committed to being there. The subdural would have been caught eventually, he said, but eventually is not always fast enough. No, she said. It isn't. A pause. He was looking at her chart. Your documentation on the drill reclassification yesterday, he said. I reviewed the footage. She kept writing. Your reasoning was sound, he said. I'm pulling the evaluation note. She stopped writing, up at him. He was already looking somewhere else, back toward the main floor, because he was not the kind of person who found this kind of moment comfortable, which she did not hold against him. Being good at medicine and being good at accountability were skills that developed on different timelines, and not everyone got to both. Thank you, sir, she said. He nodded and walked away. She went back to her documentation. She was still finishing it at 1510 when Park appeared at her elbow, slightly pale. Someone's here for you, Park said. Waiting room. It's not medical. Emily looked up. Who? He showed a CD badge, Park said. Emily put down her pen. She understood somewhere in the shift of her chest that whatever Pharaoh had been working toward since the morning meeting had moved faster than she'd expected. She walked to the waiting room. It wasn't Pharaoh. It was a man she hadn't seen before, younger, CID by the badge, with the expression of someone delivering information he'd been briefed on, but had not himself assembled. Specialist Hale, he said. We've located Garrett Lund on base. He was informed of the investigation this afternoon. He paused, and in the pause was the specific qualities of someone about to say the part they hadn't been sure how to say. He's requesting to speak to your grandfather before he speaks to CID. He says he has something to give him. Emily stared at him. He says it's a document, the agent said. He wouldn't describe it further. He'll only give it directly to Walter Hale. The waiting room was quiet around them, the ambient sounds of the base, the distant machinery, the ordinary afternoon, proceeding on every side of the thing that was happening at its center. Emily thought about the rubber-banded bundle on Cross's desk, the worn letter, the photograph, the index card. 30 years of a man keeping things that were his, because no one else was going to keep them for him. She took out her phone. She called Walter. He answered on the second ring. Are you still on base? She said. Parking lot, he said. I was waiting to see if you needed anything before I drove back. She had not known he was still there. He had not told her. He had simply waited in the parking lot in case. I need you to come inside, she said. There's someone who says he has something for you. A silence. Lund, Walter said. The fact that he had known immediately had heard the weight in her voice and located it correctly. On the first try told her that this was not a surprise to him. That whatever Lund had, Walter had suspected it existed. Yes, she said. A longer silence this time. She could hear him breathing steady, controlled. The breathing of a person who has had 30 years to decide how he was going to handle the moment when it came. All right, Walter said. I'm coming in. Emily put the phone in her pocket. She looked at the CID agent, who was watching her with the neutral attentiveness of someone trained to observe without editorializing. He'll be here in 5 minutes, she said. The agent nodded. And in the waiting room of Daxton Medical, in the middle of an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, Emily stood with her hands at her sides and waited for the door to open, understanding that whatever was about to walk through it was going to change the shape of the story that had been running, underground and unacknowledged, for longer than she had been alive. The door opened. Walter walked in, and behind him, escorted by 2 CID personnel, and moving with the careful gait of a man who understood that every step he took now was being observed and recorded, came Garrett Lund, carrying a sealed envelope, and wearing the expression of someone who had spent 29 years outrunning something, and had finally, on a gray October afternoon in Wyoming, run out of road. Lund was 63 years old. and he looked every year of it in a way that had nothing to do with age, and everything to do with the specific exhaustion of a man who had been managing a lie for so long that the management had become the dominant activity of his life. He was in civilian clothes, gray jacket, dark trousers, the kind of unremarkable dress that consultants wore to blend into military environments without claiming membership in them. His hair was silver. His hands were steady, which Emily noticed, because steady hands on a man in his position required either tremendous discipline or genuine absence of conscience, and she had not yet determined which applied. The sealed envelope was standard letter size, manila, with nothing written on the outside. 2 CID personnel who had escorted him stayed near the waiting room entrance. Farrow had not come in person, she was. Emily would learn later, in another building managing the paperwork side of what was happening. But the agent who had come for Emily was still present, positioned near the window, his hands at his sides, doing nothing that looked like watching and doing it very deliberately. Walter stood 4 feet from Lund. He had his hands at his sides. He was looking at Lund with an expression that Emily had never seen on him before, and was working to classify not anger, not contempt, not the complicated sorrow she'd seen when the day at the gate had pushed against his composure. This was something older and more settled than any of those. The expression of a man who has known something for a very long time and is now simply watching it arrive. Lund, said Mr. Hale. Walter, said Mr. Lund. Neither of them moved. Lund held out the envelope. I've had this since 2001, he said. It should have gone through proper channels in 1997. Didn't. Walter didn't take the envelope immediately. He looked at it. Then he looked at Lund's face. What's in it? The original commendation, Lund said. The approved version. Lieutenant Colonel Astor submitted it. The review board processed it and approved it, and it was forwarded to my division for entry into your file. He paused. I removed it before entry. I placed the hold instead. Commendation was never formally voided, it was approved, and I removed it from the process before it could be recorded. The waiting room was very quiet. The CID agent by the window had gone absolutely still. Why, Walter said. It was not a question, precisely. It was the word used when a question has been held for so long it has become something flatter and harder. Lund looked at the envelope in his hand. Colonel Astor and I had a dispute. In 1996. Professional disagreement that became personal. He had documentation on a separate matter, procurement irregularities in a supply contract I had authorized. He hadn't filed it yet, but he was going to. He stopped. Commendation was leverage. If I buried it, he had reason to stay quiet. If I released it, he had no reason to protect me. Emily felt something cold move through her. Not surprised she had understood, from the moment Farrow said financial, that there was something underneath the administrative decision, something that made a combat medic's recognition worth managing. But hearing it stated plainly, a man's 30 years of erasure traded as currency in someone else's corruption produced a specific kind of cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Walter was looking at Lund. Raymond Astor died in 2018, he said. I know, Lund said. He never filed the documentation. No, Lund said. He never did. And you kept the commendation. A silence. I couldn't destroy it, Lund said, which was not the same thing as keeping it for virtuous reasons, and they both understood that. Walter took the envelope. He held it for a moment without opening it, feeling the weight of it, whatever weight a document has when it contains something that was owed for 3 decades and is now arriving 29 years late. Then he handed it to Emily without a word. She took it. She looked at Lund. This needs to go to Farrow, she said to the CID agent. Yes, the agent said. He was already moving. Lund looked at Walter one more time. He appeared to be considering saying something further, something that might have been in the territory of apology, or explanation, or the kind of statement that a person makes when they are trying to close something they cannot actually close. Whatever it was, he didn't say it. He looked at Walter's face and apparently found there exactly what Walter intended him to find. Nothing that would make this easier. He looked down. He let the CID agents move him toward the door. Walter watched him go. Then he turned to Emily and said, "Let me see it." She gave him the envelope. He opened it carefully, the way he handled things that mattered, not reverently, not with ceremony, but with attention. He unfolded the document inside. He read it. He read it again. His expression did not change in any way that could be described in terms of visible emotion, and Emily, who had been watching his face her entire life, saw underneath that control something that required all of it, the full 30 years of practice, to hold. He folded it again, put it back in the envelope, handed it back to her. "Keep it safe," he said. "I will," she said. He nodded once. He was looking at the wall, at nothing specific, and his hands were in his pockets. and he was breathing the way she recognized the slow, deliberate breathing of a man who is giving himself the time he needs. She did not say anything. She had learned from him that some things needed the space of silence before they could be moved through, and that providing that space was its own form of care. After a moment, he said, "I'm going to get coffee." "There's a machine down the hall." "Third door on the left," she said. He walked away. She watched him go, and then she turned and went to find Pharaoh. The afternoon disassembled itself into procedural pieces. Emily gave Pharaoh the envelope and stayed while Pharaoh read it, photographed it, logged it into evidence, and made 3 phone calls in succession that Emily was not privy to, but could read from the particular quality of Pharaoh's posture, the way she stood straighter with each call, the way her voice stayed level but acquired a kind of density that meant the calls were going up the chain and the chain was responding. By 1700, the procurement irregularity that Lund had buried alongside Walter's commendation had been formally referred to a separate investigative track. 2 matters were now officially connected, which meant that what had started as a records audit had expanded into something larger and more structurally significant than a single document held out of a file. Lund's consulting contract with Fort Daxton was suspended by 1730. Not pending review, suspended outright, effective immediately, pending the outcome of the investigation. His base access badge was deactivated. Someone from the contracting office came to collect his equipment from the office space he'd occupied, and that process, the quiet, administrative finality of a badge being cut off and a desk being cleared, was witnessed by enough people on the base that by the time the duty day ended, story had moved through the informal network that exists on every military installation faster than any official communication could have carried it. Emily heard about the contract suspension from Reyes, who appeared at the trauma unit at 1745, with the expression of someone delivering information they find professionally satisfying. Lund's outrage said, "Contract suspended, access pulled. CID has him for a statement tomorrow morning. The procurement file is going to JAG." She paused. "Commendation review is being expedited. Cross-filed for emergency processing, given that the commendation was approved in 1994, and the hold was unauthorized. The legal argument is that it should have been in Walter's file for 30 years. Question is what form the formal recognition takes, and on what timeline." "How long?" Emily said. "Weeks, not months." Reyes looked at her steadily. "The IG doesn't move fast often. When it does, it's because someone with rank pushed, and someone with authority agreed to be pushed. Cross pushed hard today." Emily thought about Cross standing from his desk when Walter entered the room that morning. The full stand. The thing it had meant. "I know," she said. She finished her shift at 1900. Walter was in the parking lot he had stayed, again, without telling her, which was its own kind of Walter Hale communication. He had a coffee cup from the machine, and he was sitting on the bench outside the entrance watching the sky, which had cleared during the afternoon, cloud cover finally breaking into something that showed the mountains properly for the first time since she'd arrived at Fort Daxton. Peaks to the west were sharp and lit amber in the late afternoon light. She sat beside him. He handed her the coffee cup, which was mostly empty and very cold. She held it anyway. "Reyes says weeks," she said. "Cross told me the same," Walter said. "He came to find me in the parking lot an hour ago." She looked at him. He was looking at the mountains. "How are you doing?" she said. He considered this with the same seriousness he applied to everything. "I'm not sure yet," he said. "Ask me in a few days." That was honest, which was what she expected from him, and it was enough. They sat together for a few minutes without talking, the way they had always been able to, the specific comfort of 2 people who had never needed language to fill the space between them. Then Walter said, "How's the posting going?" She made a short sound that was almost a laugh. "Complicated, good complicated or bad complicated." She thought about the 60-day evaluation note that Adrian had pulled, about Moro's concussion and Olvera's subdural and the drill reclassification that had cost her a morning and a documentation problem and then been acknowledged, however reluctantly, by the person whose acknowledgement mattered. About Zuck saying "good catch" in the particular way that meant something was changing. "Working complicated," she said. "The kind that might resolve if I keep doing the work." Walter nodded. "That's the kind worth having," he said. He left at 1930, driving north toward Montana in the dark, the way he'd come. She stood in the parking lot until his truck's taillights disappeared around the access road curve, and then she went back inside and wrote up her end-of-shift notes and did not let herself think too far ahead. The next 6 days were the particular kind of intense that doesn't announce itself, built in the way pressure builds in a closed system, not dramatically, not in a way that was visible from outside, but accumulating in every interaction and every document and every conversation until the whole structure was carrying more weight than it had been designed for. Lund's CID interview lasted 4 hours. Emily didn't know the content directly, but Farrow confirmed that he had provided a full account, not out of contrition, she made clear, but because his legal counsel had apparently advised him that cooperation was the only viable strategy given what the investigation already had. The procurement file that Astor had never filed had, it turned out, existed in 2 forms. The one Astor had assembled and never submitted, which had died with him, and a parallel documentation trail that Lund himself had maintained, apparently as insurance against exactly the kind of situation he now found himself in. The logic of a man who had spent decades protecting himself by keeping records of the thing he needed protection from was not straightforward, but it was real, and it had given Farrow's team a paper trail that extended well beyond the Hale commendation. Procurement irregularities connected to a supply contract from 1,996. The amounts involved were significant. 3 other names appeared in the documentation. One of them had retired from the military and was now a civilian in Oregon. One of them was deceased. The third was still active duty, currently serving at a different installation, and was placed under administrative review on day 4 of the investigation. Emily learned this in pieces, from Reyes and from Cross, who had made a quiet point of keeping her informed at a level that was appropriate given her relation to Walter and the role she'd played in surfacing the investigation. She processed each piece the way she processed difficult patient information, not by bracketing it until later, but by integrating it into the active picture as it arrived, adjusting her understanding of the shape of things as the shape changed. On day 5, Okafor called her in. The meeting was in the same small organized office. Same 2 chairs, but the folder on the desk was different, thicker, and positioned in a way that suggested it had been recently reviewed rather than prepared for review. Okafor looked at Emily with the same professional composure she always deployed, and underneath it this time was something that Emily read as discomfort, which on Okafor's face was barely perceptible but present. "Your 60-day evaluation," Okafor said. "Yes, ma'am. Captain Aldrin has submitted an interim performance review. He's done this 3 weeks into what should be a 60-day period, which is irregular." She looked at the folder. His assessment is positive. He's citing the Morrow and Olvera catches specifically, and the drill reclassification, which he's reframed as evidence of clinical adaptability under pressure. Paused on that phrase for just a fraction too long, as if it required additional processing. He's recommending that the 60-day evaluation period be reduced to 30 days based on demonstrated performance. Emily said, "What's your position on that recommendation?" Okafor looked at her directly. It was the first time in their 3 interactions that the look felt like actual engagement rather than assessment. "My position," she said, "is that my concern in our first meeting was about integration, whether your civilian background would translate well to this environment." She was quiet for a moment. "On the evidence of last week, I think I was measuring the wrong thing." She said this without visible pleasure, which Emily respected. It was harder to revise an assessment without pleasure than with it. "I'm going to support Aldrin's recommendation. 30-day evaluation period. Your file will reflect that." "Thank you, ma'am." Okafor nodded. She closed the folder. Started to say something, stopped, started again. "Your grandfather's situation," she said. "I've heard some of what's happened this week. Not the details, I'm not in that chain, but some of it." Emily waited. "I want to say..." Okafor paused again, and the pause had the quality of someone choosing between several versions of the same sentence. "I think what happened to his record was wrong, and I think what he did at that field position should have been recognized 30 years ago." She looked at Emily carefully. "That's all I wanted to say." It was not an apology. It was not required to be one, but it was something, and Emily received it as something. "I appreciate that, ma'am," she said. She walked out of Okafor's office and stood in the corridor for a moment. The bass hummed around her vehicles, distant voices, the mechanical sounds of a large installation doing what it did. Took one breath and went back to work. The formal notification came on day 7. It arrived first to Cross, then to Walter, then through Walter, who called her from the driveway of the Montana house because he had pulled over when the call came and then sat in the driveway for a while before he called her to Emily. The Army Records Division, acting on the expedited review authorized by the Inspector General's office and supported by Cross's witness statement, the evidence bundle, and the now confirmed illegitimacy of the 1,997 hold, had formally processed the 1,994 commendation. Walter Hale's service record had been corrected and updated. Commendation was now on file dated correctly, with a notation acknowledging the administrative gap and its cause. There would be a formal ceremony. Daxton had volunteered to host it. Cross had pushed for that specifically because the base where Walter had been turned away from the gate was going to be the base where he received what should have been his 30 years ago. The date was being coordinated. Walter would receive official notification within the week. Emily heard all of this through the phone, standing in the break room of the trauma unit on her lunch break, and she did not say anything for a long moment after Walter finished. "Grandpa," she said. "I know," he said. "Are you okay?" A short pause. "I'm sitting in the driveway," he said. "I've been sitting here for about 15 minutes. That's allowed." "I know it is." Another pause, and in it she could hear him, the particular quality of a man who had been carrying something for 30 years and had just felt a portion of its weight shift, not disappear, but move. "I don't know what I was expecting," he said. "I think I stopped expecting anything a long time ago." "I know," she said. "The ceremony," he said. "You'll be there." "I'll be there," she said. "I'll arrange it. Don't make a production of it." "I'm not making anything," she said. "Cross is making it. I'm just going to be standing next to you." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh but occupied the same territory. "I'm going to go inside now. Drive safe," she said, by habit, and then caught herself. "You're in the driveway. I know where I am, Emmy." She smiled at her phone. "I know you do," she said. "Call me later." After she hung up, she stood in the break room for another minute. Coffee machine was running through a cycle, filling the small space with the smell of something mediocre. She thought about the photograph in the evidence bundle, the black and white image of a younger Walter, crouched over a patient in a field position, the economy of his movement, visible even in a still image, the absolute focus of a person doing the thing they were built to do. She thought about the 30 years between that photograph and the plastic chair in the overflow area, about the gap between what a person does and what the record says they did, and how long that gap can exist, and what it costs, and what it takes to close it. Poured the bad coffee and went back to work. On the morning of day 9, Marcus Vale appeared at the trauma unit. He was off-duty civilian clothes, no rank visible, looking like a man who had thought about coming here several times and had finally made himself do it. He asked at the nursing station for Emily Hale and was directed to the workstation where she was completing morning chart reviews. Stood with his hands at his sides and his jaw set in the way of someone who has rehearsed a thing and is now discovering that the rehearsal and the actual moment are different experiences. He was younger up close than he had appeared at the gate, mid to late 20s, probably less than a year into this posting, the particular combination of certainty and inexperience that produced the specific kind of mistake he had made. "Specialist Hale," he said. She looked up from the tablet. "I wanted to say this in person," he said. "What I did with your grandfather at the gate, I made a judgment based on how he looked and what he was carrying. That was wrong. I should have verified the portal correctly, and I should have treated him like the confirmed visitor he was." He stopped. His jaw moved slightly. "I heard what happened, about his service record and what he did. I didn't know any of that when I made the call, but it doesn't change the fact that the call was wrong. He deserved better than I gave him." Emily looked at him for a long moment. Carrying this, she could see that. Not performing it, actually carrying it, which was different. She thought about saying several things and discarded all of them. "Tell him you said that," she said. Vale nodded. He looked as though he'd expected something more, or perhaps something less, and was recalibrating. "How is he?" he said. "He's doing well," she said. "He drove 11 hours to a graduation, sat in a diesel exhaust zone for 2 hours, and then helped close a 29-year investigation. He's managing." Vale looked at her. He didn't say anything else. He nodded once more and walked back toward the door. Emily watched him go. She did not feel satisfaction exactly. She felt the absence of something, the sharp edge that had been present since the parking lot on graduation day, when she'd walked through the gate and found her grandfather in a plastic chair. It hadn't disappeared. It had simply been placed where it belonged, in the record, which was now open, and in the process that was still running. She went back to her charts. It was Bach who interrupted her 20 minutes later, appearing at her workstation, with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not the reluctant professionalism that had characterized their first days, not the quiet recalibration of the drill aftermath, but something that looked like uncomplicated respect, which on Bach's face was apparently the rarest thing. "Cross wants you," he said. "His office now. Both of you, he said, to bring your grandfather if he's reachable." Emily looked up. "What is it?" Bach's expression shifted into something she still couldn't fully read. "Farrow's team found something new," he said, "in the procurement file. Something that goes past Lund." She put down the tablet. "How far past?" Far enough, Bach said, that Cross has a congressional liaison on the phone. Emily was already reaching for her phone to call Walter when it rang in her hand. Screen showed a number she didn't recognize, a Washington area code. She answered. The voice on the other end was a woman she had never spoken to, identifying herself as a senior counsel to the Senate Armed Services Committee. She said she was calling regarding the investigation at Fort Daxton, specifically the records matter involving Walter Hale's service commendation and the associated procurement documentation that had been referred to the committee's oversight jurisdiction. She said the committee intended to hold a hearing. She said Walter Hale had been requested to appear as a witness. She said the hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out. She said, and this was the part that stopped Emily's breath for a moment, not because it was unexpected, but because hearing it said aloud by someone from a Senate committee in a Washington area code made it real in a way that the last 9 days had not yet quite achieved, that the documentation Lund's team had uncovered in the procurement file included a second set of records that had been concealed alongside Walter's commendation. A second set of records belonging to 4 other soldiers whose commendations had been processed through Lund's division in the same period. 4 other names, 4 other files, 4 other holds placed on 4 other records, in the same division, in the same years, for the same reason, because Raymond Astor had known about the procurement corruption, and the commendations of soldiers who had served under his command had been the currency Lund had used to buy his silence. Emily stood in the trauma unit hallway with the phone pressed to her ear, looking at nothing, and understood that what had started as her grandfather's story had just become something much larger than either of them, and that the shape of justice, when it finally arrived, was almost never the shape you had been able to imagine when you first started looking for it. Stood in the hallway for another 10 seconds after the call ended, holding the phone against her sternum, looking at the wall. Then she called Walter. He answered on the first ring, which meant he'd been waiting, not necessarily for her specifically, but in the general posture of waiting that he had settled into over the last 9 days. The alert stillness of a man who understood that things were still moving and that movement required readiness. Senate Armed Services Committee, she said. They want you as a witness. Hearing in 3 weeks. She paused, and there are 4 other names in the file. 4 other soldiers whose commendations Lund suppressed for the same reason. The silence on Walter's end was different from his other silences. Longer, heavier in a specific way. 4, he said. Another silence. Do you have the names? Not yet. Farrow's team is working through the documentation. Cross will know soon. She heard him breathe in, out. Slow, deliberate rhythm she recognized. Those families, he said. If any of them are still, if there are people who've been waiting. I know, she said. I know. This isn't just about my file anymore, he said, and there was something in his voice that she had not heard in all the days, since graduation, not grief exactly, not anger, but a kind of enormous responsibility settling onto him, the weight of being the first domino in a chain that had been waiting to fall for decades. It never was, really. I just didn't know the scope of it. Come back to the base, she said. Cross wants us both. Farrow's team has more. I'm leaving now, he said, and hung up. Put her phone in her pocket and went to find Bach to tell him she needed coverage for the next few hours. He looked at her face, read something in it, and said simply go. Park can cover your charts. I'll flag you if anything critical comes in. He did not ask what was happening, which was its own form of professional respect, and she appreciated it without saying so. She walked to Cross's office. The room had more people in it than it had held before. Cross was behind his desk. Farrow was there with a second CID agent Emily hadn't met. Gould from the IG's office was in the corner, and there was a new face, a man in his early 50s in a Class A uniform, colonel's rank, who introduced himself as Colonel Marcus Thane from the Judge Advocate General's Corps. His presence reconfigured the meeting before a single word was said about content, because JAG did not attend investigative briefings unless the findings had reached the threshold where legal consequences were no longer theoretical. Thane had a folder. Everyone had folders. Emily was the only person in the room without one, which made her feel briefly and irrationally underprepared, and then she reminded herself that she was not an investigator, and her role here was as a witness and as Walter's family, and she did not need a folder to fulfill either of those functions. Farrow opened first. Since the last briefing, CID has completed a preliminary review of the secondary documentation set recovered from Lund's personal files. The set includes 4 additional service commendations, all submitted through the Records Review Division between 1,993 and 1,997, all placed on administrative hold with Lund's signature, none of them subsequently processed. She looked around the room. The 4 soldiers are Corporal James Abernethy, Sergeant Dolores Mack, Corporal Wyatt Pruitt, and Staff Sergeant Leonard Osei. All served in units that overlapped with Lieutenant Colonel Astor's command during the relevant period. All 4 holds cite the same administrative language as the Hale hold pending verification of field documentation accuracy. None of the 4 have follow-up verification reports. The room was quiet. Cross said current status of the 4? Abernethy is deceased 2019. Mack is alive, 71 years old, lives in Georgia. Pruitt is alive 68, lives in Arizona. Osei is alive 74, lives in Maryland. Farrow paused. Osei has a daughter who has been attempting to petition for a review of his service record for 6 years. She hit the same wall every time the hold flagged in the system. The division saying it was under review, no resolution. 6 years Emily absorbed that. A daughter, 6 years, the same administrative wall, the same closed door. She thought about the 4 months she had been working on Walter's situation and how long 4 months had already felt. And then she thought about 6 years, and the arithmetic of what institutional obstruction costs the people it touches was not abstract anymore. Thane spoke for the first time. Commendation documentation, combined with the procurement records and Lund's own testimony, gives JAG sufficient grounds to pursue charges on multiple counts, including obstruction of military records, misuse of official authority, and conduct unbecoming under relevant statute. He looked at his folder. Lund's cooperation in his CD interview has been noted and will be considered in the charging process, but cooperation is not immunity. The Senate Committee's interest also means this won't be resolved. At the installation level it goes up. How far up? Cross said. Thane looked at him. The procurement contracts touch 3 installations over 7 years. Total figure under examination is, he named a number that sat in the room like an object, which means congressional oversight is not optional. Going public. Emily looked at Cross. He was looking at the desk surface with the expression of a man who has been trying to correct something for 30 years and is now watching the mechanism of correction activate at a scale he hadn't anticipated. It was not satisfaction on his face. It was something more complicated, the recognition that the right outcome and the clean outcome were not always the same thing, and that what was coming was going to be right but was not going to be clean. Walter arrived 20 minutes into the briefing. He came in quietly, found the chair beside Emily, and sat. Cross nodded at him. Walter nodded back. He listened to the remainder of the briefing without speaking, and Emily watched his face process the 4 names Abernethy, Mack, Pruitt, Osei, and watched something in him shift at each one, a small internal accounting, the recognition that his story had always been plural, even when it was forced into singular form. When Farrow finished, Walter said, Mack and Pruitt and Osei, have they been contacted? CID will make contact today, Farrow said. Their families should know before it goes public. Walter said. Whatever the timeline is on the committee hearing, those people deserve to know privately before they see it anywhere else. Farrow looked at him. That's the protocol, she said. We'll have it done before any public statement. Walter nodded. He asked 2 more questions, precise, practical questions, about the records correction process for the other 4, and whether the commendations would be processed on the same expedited track his had been, and the answers were yes and yes. And Walter said nothing further. He sat with his hands on his knees and listened to the rest of the room, worked through the procedural infrastructure of the next 3 weeks. And Emily sat beside him and did the same. 3 weeks that followed were not clean. She had known they wouldn't be. Lund's suspension produced a secondary effect nobody had fully anticipated. 2 members of his contracting team, both civilian employees, immediately retained legal representation and began making their own disclosures in an attempt to position themselves ahead of the investigation's conclusions. One of those disclosures produced documentation of a 3rd procurement contract from 2004 that had nothing to do with Astor or the 1990s and everything to do with a different set of institutional relationships that Lund had cultivated after his retirement. The investigation expanded again. Farrow's team was supplemented by 2 additional agents. The JAG process added personnel. The IG's office filed an interim report that was classified at the installation level and then reclassified at the committee level and then partially declassified for the public record in the way that these things always went in pieces, with redactions, the truth arriving in increments rather than all at once. Emily worked through all of it. She had 60-day evaluation marks due, then 30-day marks, then a full assessment review. She had Morrow's follow-up imaging to coordinate, and Olvera's orthopedic referral to track, and a new patient, a logistics sergeant named Ferris, who came in with what presented as a severe migraine and left with a hypertensive crisis diagnosis. Caught because Emily had checked his blood pressure trend over 48 hours rather than a single reading, which was the kind of thing that looked like overreach until it looked like the correct call. Adrian signed off on the Farah's documentation without comment, which was itself a form of comment. Bach took to dropping by her workstation in the last 20 minutes of her shifts, with the case that a person adopts when they are providing something they won't call mentorship because that would require admitting they've revised their initial assessment more completely than is comfortable. He talked about cases, about the unit's history, about the specific challenges of military trauma medicine that her civilian background hadn't prepared her for, not to undercut her, she understood, but to hand her things that would make her better, which was a different impulse entirely. She listened. She asked questions. She told him twice when she thought he was wrong, which he received with the short pause of someone recalculating and then the reluctant nod of someone who has come to respect the source of the disagreement. She was not universally liked in the unit. There was a corpsman named De Vries who had decided in the first week that her assessment style was arrogant and had not revised that opinion, and probably would not. There was a nurse 2 years her senior named Castillo, who was scrupulously professional with Emily and scrupulously cold outside of professional necessity, for reasons Emily had not fully identified. The unit had its alliances and its histories and its embedded dynamics, and Emily was an outsider to all of them, and some of that would ease with time, and some of it would not. That was the reality of any closed professional system. She did not mistake the complexity of the environment for hostility, but she did not pretend the complexity wasn't there. Walter called every 3 days. They talked about the case, and about the hearing preparation, and about the 4 other names, and occasionally about other things: a neighbor's dog in Montana, a book he was reading, the weather. She told him about Olvera's recovery, which was complete and uneventful, and about Morrow's follow-up, which was clear. Questions about both. He always asked questions. The Senate's Armed Services Committee hearing was held on a Tuesday morning in November, 3 weeks and 2 days after the initial contact from the committee's senior counsel. It was not televised in full, these things rarely were, but it was public record, open to observers, and the room was full in a way that Walter had not expected when he walked in. Emily was beside him. She had arranged leave for 2 days. She had helped him prepare his statement, which he had written himself and revised twice, cutting it each time, removing the parts that explained what the listener should feel, and leaving only the parts that said what had happened, because that was how he communicated without instruction, trusting the facts to carry the weight. Cross was there. He had come on his own time and his own travel, in uniform, and he sat in the 3rd row of the observer section. He had submitted a written statement to the committee in advance his 1,994 account of the Kendra Station engagement, formally recorded now, 32 years after he'd written it the first time and watched it go nowhere. Mac and Pruitt and O.C. were there. Emily saw them before Walter did, 3 people in their late 60s and 70s, in varying degrees of health, with varying numbers of family members beside them, carrying 30 years of a particular kind of unanswered question in their postures. O.C.'s daughter, who had spent 6 years pushing against the wall, was sitting next to her father with her hand over his, and when she looked up and met Emily's eyes across the room, there was something in her expression that Emily recognized, the look of someone who has been dismissed and documented and redirected and told to wait and has kept going anyway, and is now, in some not yet complete way, arriving. Walter's testimony took 40 minutes. He was factual. He was precise. He answered the committee members' questions without editorializing and without asking them to feel anything in particular about what he was describing. And the result was that the room felt things anyway, the way rooms do when the information is specific enough to be real and the person delivering it is steady enough to be believed. He described the Kendra Station engagement in the kind of detail that only comes from lived memory: the specific positions, the specific injuries, the specific decisions made under specific pressure, the way field medicine works when the resources are wrong and the situation is deteriorating, and the only thing you have to offer is the knowledge in your hands and the decision not to stop. He described the commendation submission and the 3 attempts to follow up and the silence that had followed all of them. He described the graduation gate and the plastic chair and the 2 hours he spent in the diesel exhaust zone, while his granddaughter received her certification 40 yards away. He did not describe any of it with anger. He described it with the matter-of-fact precision of someone reporting what occurred, and that precision made the room very quiet. One of the committee members, a senator from the Midwest, a veteran herself, who had been listening with her hands flat on the table in front of her, said, when Walter finished, Mr. Hale, in 30 years of trying to access your own record, did anyone ever offer you an explanation for why it was unavailable? Administrative error, Walter said. 3 times. Administrative review, once. After 1,998, nothing at all. The senator looked at the table for a moment. I'm going to tell you something that the committee's review of this case has made very clear to me, she said. What happened to your record was not an error. It was a decision, made by a person with authority, for reasons that had nothing to do with your service and everything to do with protecting his own. And I want that on the record, said plainly, because the word error has been doing a lot of work for a long time in this case, and it should stop. Walter looked at her. He said, "Thank you," 2 words. He did not elaborate. He did not have to. The committee's findings were released 6 weeks after the hearing. Thorough, specifically worded, and public. Garrett Lund was formally charged on 3 counts, including fraudulent concealment of military records and misappropriation of contracting authority. The 3rd count, the procurement fraud, compounded across 7 years, and 3 installations carried the weight that meant his legal exposure was not a matter of administrative penalty, but of federal prosecution. His consulting contract was formally terminated and barred from renewal. His access to any military installation was permanently revoked. The active duty officer identified in Lund's documentation, who had spent 3 weeks since the initial review loudly disputing the findings through his legal counsel, was found to have signed off on 2 of the subsidiary contracts and was referred for a courts-martial process that would take longer than the civilian proceedings but would be thorough. His rank did not protect him. The committee's report made specific note of that. Rank, the report stated, was not a mechanism of insulation when the conduct in question was the abuse of rank itself. 5 commendations, Walter's and those of Abernethy, Mack, Pruitt, and O.C. were formally processed and entered into the official record simultaneously. The Records Division, noting in each case the original approval date of 1,994 or 1,995, and the administrative hold that had prevented recording, and the findings that the hold had been unauthorized, and the underlying commendation valid from the moment of original approval. Abernethy's went to his next of kin, a daughter in her 40s who had not known it existed. The other 4 were delivered to the soldiers themselves. Walter's arrived in the mail, as all official military correspondence did, in a standard envelope, processed through the proper channels, exactly as it should have been processed 31 years earlier. Called Emily when it came. He didn't read it to her over the phone. He just said, "It's here." She said, "I know," and they were quiet for a moment. "How does it look?" she said. "Like a piece of paper," he said, and she could hear in it the complicated truth of that, the way that the physical object, after this much time and this much weight, was simultaneously the most important thing and a smaller thing than everything that had surrounded it. Recognition, when it finally arrived, was real. It was also just paper. The meaning was in the 31 years, not in the document. The document was just the record finally matching the reality. The ceremony at Fort Daxton was held on a Saturday in December, 3 days before Christmas. The parade field was cold. Wyoming in December was a particular kind of cold that had presence and weight, and the folding chair set up for observers filled faster than the base had anticipated, which meant people were standing at the edges by the time it started. Emily had not expected that. She had expected something small, something procedural. What she got was something that the base had apparently decided, on its own initiative and without particular direction from above, to treat as an occasion. Cross had something to do with that. She suspected Reyes had something to do with it too. Bach appeared in the observer section in his dress uniform, which he had not been required to wear, which told her something. Aldrin was there, which told her something else. Okafor was there, standing in the back with her hands clasped and her posture impeccable, and when she caught Emily's eye across the crowd she nodded once. Precise. The same nod she used when something in the unit had gone correctly. Mac was there, flown in from Georgia with her daughter and 2 grandchildren. O.C. was there with his daughter, the one who had spent 6 years pushing, sitting next to him, and looking at the proceedings with an expression that Emily could not name cleanly but recognized. Specific look of someone who has been carrying something for so long that its absence doesn't feel like relief so much as a new kind of disorientation, a body learning what it means to put weight down. Pruitt had come from Arizona with his wife. He was a quiet man. It turned out quiet in the way that Walter was quiet, the kind that came from having been shaped by things that didn't lend themselves to easy explanation. He and Walter had met for the first time an hour before the ceremony, in the room where the honorees had been brought together, and Emily had watched the 2 of them stand near each other for several minutes, barely speaking. because the specific understanding they shared did not require explanation between them. The ceremony was run by Cross, which was fitting. Stood at the front of the parade field in his dress uniform, in the Wyoming cold, and he did not speak for very long, because he understood that long speeches were not the point of what was happening. He read each commendation, beginning with Abernethy's acknowledged in his absence, received by his daughter, who was crying in the third row, and not trying to stop, and working through Mac Pruitt, O.C., and finally Walter. He read them with the same steadiness he had brought to every part of this process, unhurried, without drama, giving each name the full weight of being spoken clearly in a public place after a long silence. When he read Walter's, he looked up from the paper once briefly, and looked at Walter, who was standing at the front in a pressed gray shirt and his good boots, and the particular stillness of a man who had decided this morning that he was going to receive this without deflecting, which Emily knew had cost him something. The applause when Cross finished was not the polite general applause of a routine ceremony. It was the kind that starts from somewhere genuine and builds, because the people contributing to it mean it differently, each of them, depending on what the last 3 months have meant to them, or what the last 30 years have meant to them, or what the word recognition means when it is applied to something that has been withheld. It lasted longer than Emily expected. She was not going to cry, she had decided that she wasn't, and then she looked at O.C.'s daughter, who was applauding with her eyes closed, and that decision became harder to maintain. Walter stood through the applause the way he stood through most things, correct, with his hands at his sides, looking slightly to the left of what was directly in front of him. Was the specific place he looked when he was processing something that he was not ready to show on his face. Emily was standing beside him. She did not touch his arm or say anything. She had learned from 30 years of knowing him that proximity was sometimes the only form of support that didn't interrupt. After the ceremony, there was a reception. Coffee that was better than the trauma unit sandwiches, the ambience and sound of a group of people gradually returning to ordinary conversation after something that hadn't been ordinary. Mac found Walter and they spoke for 20 minutes. Emily did not hover, but she could see them from across the room. 2 people in their 70s, with 3 decades of parallel experience between them, talking in the low, unhurried way of people who understand each other's reference points without needing to establish them. Cross came to Emily while Walter was occupied. He had a cup of coffee and the look of someone who has completed a very long task and is only beginning to understand how long it was. He handled that well, Cross said. He handles everything well, Emily said. It's annoying sometimes. Cross made a sound that was as close to a laugh as she'd heard from him. How's the posting going? Better, she said. Complicated, but better. Complicated is honest, he said. He looked across the room at Walter. He raised you himself? From 7, she said, after my parents died. Car accident, Cross nodded. Quiet for a moment, looking at Walter, and then he said something that she hadn't expected from him, something that stepped outside the professional register he'd occupied throughout the entire process. I wrote that statement in 1994. 19 years old, sitting in a recovery ward. I wrote it because someone told me to document what happened, and I did. I had no idea it went nowhere. He paused. I've thought about it a lot over the years. Whether I should have pushed harder. Whether there was something I could have done for my rank at the time. He looked at his coffee. There wasn't. But that doesn't stop you from thinking about it. Emily looked at him. This man had been carrying his own version of this for 30 years, not the erasure, but the awareness of the erasure, and the impotence of knowing something was wrong and not having the standing to correct it. The weight of witnesses was different from the weight of subjects, but it was real and it accumulated. Pushed when you had the rank to push, she said. Could do. That's what you did. He looked at her. He nodded once, the way he had nodded at Walter the first day. You're going to be good at this, he said. The medicine. The whole thing. She didn't say thank you because that felt insufficient. She said, I'm working at it. He accepted that. They stood together for another moment, watching the room, and then he moved toward O.C.'s daughter, who had been waiting patiently to speak to him, and Emily moved toward Walter, who had finished with Mac and was now standing slightly apart from the main crowd, doing the thing he did when he was giving himself time. Stood beside him. He had a plate of food he hadn't touched, and a cup of coffee he was holding in both hands the way he always held coffee. Outside the window behind him, the parade field was empty now, the folding chairs being stacked by a detail of soldiers in the cold, the mountains visible and clear to the west, the winter light on them flat and precise and very bright. Okay, she said. He looked at the mountains. Abernethy's daughter, he said. She came over. She said she didn't know her father had done anything like what the commendation described. He never talked about it. Emily was quiet. She said she wished she'd known while he was alive. He paused. She said she thought it would have mattered to him. Someone knew. It would have, Emily said. Yes, Walter said. He was still looking at the mountains. That's the part that doesn't resolve cleanly. The ones who are gone. You can correct the record, but you can't give it to them. She did not offer comfort that would minimize that. It was true. The record correction was real, and it mattered, and it was insufficient all at the same time, and sitting with that insufficiency, without letting it invalidate the rest of it, was the kind of thing that required a specific kind of moral seriousness that she had learned, again, from the man standing beside her. I know, she said. He nodded. He took a sip of his coffee. Pruitt asked me if I wanted to stay in touch, he said. With him and Mac and Osi. What did you say? I said yes. He looked at her then, and there was something in his face that she recognized as rare not happiness exactly, but the thing adjacent to it, the thing that comes when a loss is finally witnessed, and the witnessing, imperfect as it is, does something that nothing else could do. I think it'll be good, he said, to know them. I think so too, she said. They stood together in the warm room with the mountains behind the glass, and the folding chairs stacking up in the cold outside, and Emily thought about the gate. Plastic chair, the diesel exhaust, the rubber-banded bundle, the commendation that had sat in a sealed envelope in a man's filing cabinet for 23 years because he couldn't destroy it and wouldn't release it, which was its own testimony to the nature of guilt. Persists whether or not it is acknowledged. It just does its persistence underground, in places no one is supposed to look. She thought about Osi's daughter, 6 years of closed doors, and the look on her face during the ceremony. She thought about the 19-year-old Cross in a recovery ward, writing a statement that went nowhere and carrying the knowledge of that for 30 years. She thought about Abernethy's daughter who had come alone and left with a document that told her something about her father. She could no longer tell him she knew. She thought about all the things that justice, when it arrived, could and could not do, could not return the years. It could not give Abernethy his recognition while he was living, could not fully compensate for what those years of institutional silence had cost in missed recognition, in the slow corrosion of being dismissed and overlooked and explained away. Could not make the plastic chair not happen, or the gate sergeant's dismissal not happen, or the 29 years of administrative holds not happen. What it could do was name what happened. State it plainly on the record in a public place. Say, this person did this thing, and this other person suffered the consequence. And the chain between those two facts is documented and established, and will not be cleaned up or explained away. What it could do was put 5 names where they belonged in the file, in the ceremony, in the applause that built from somewhere genuine, and let those names exist in the official record with the weight they had always actually carried. That was not nothing. Emily had spent enough time in emergency rooms to know the difference between a cure and a treatment, and to know that treatment mattered even when cure was unavailable. The record was corrected. The people responsible were facing the consequences specific to what they had done. The 4 living soldiers were standing in a warm room in Wyoming in December, holding coffee, having been told by an institution that had failed them that the failure was documented, and the debt, however partially, was acknowledged. It was real. She was going to hold it as real. She was also going to go back to work on Monday and do what she did, and do it well, and do it consistently enough that 60-day evaluations became 30-day evaluations, became no evaluations at all, became simply her record, her work, accumulation of choices made correctly over time. She was not going to be universally liked. She was not going to get every call right. She was going to make the mistake that comes from overconfidence, and the mistake that comes from hesitation, and the mistake that comes from being human, in a field that demands precision, and she was going to document those mistakes, and learn from them, and keep going. The job was. That was what Walter had modeled for her across the entire span of her life. Not perfection, but persistence. Not the absence of difficulty, but the refusal to let difficulty become the ending. Thought about Vale, who had come to the trauma unit and said the thing he needed to say and been received without cruelty and without exoneration, because neither was what the moment required. She thought about Aldrin, who was better at medicine than at accountability and was slowly, imperfectly, working on the gap. She thought about Okafor, who had measured the wrong thing and said so, without theatrics. She thought about Bach, who called things good catches when they were good catches, which was more than most. None of them were clean. None of the situations were clean. The world did not run on clean situations, and the people in it did not operate in clean situations, and the idea that justice would arrive in a clean form had been disabused in her a long time ago. Justice arrived the way Walter's recognition had arrived, piece by piece, imperfectly, with friction, leaving some things permanently uncorrectable and others corrected just enough to matter. You took what it actually was and you held it, and you did not confuse it with what it should have been in a world that was other than this one. You also did not let the distance between those two things convince you that the thing you'd actually won wasn't worth the winning. Walter turned from the mountains. He looked at his granddaughter, this woman who had arrived at Fort Daxton with 11 years behind her, and a 60-day evaluation in front of her, and a grandfather turned away at the gate, and who had not made a production of any of it, had simply kept doing the next thing and the next thing and the next thing until the sum of all those things was a file that said who she was. He looked at her with the expression she knew better than any expression in the world. "Let's get some food," he said. "That plate's been sitting there. I've been watching you not eat it for 20 minutes, she said. "I was thinking, I noticed." He picked up the plate. He looked at it, looked at the room, looked at the mountains one more time. "Next time I visit," he said, "I want to come through the main gate, not the side entrance." She looked at him. "The gate where all of this started," he said quietly. "I want to walk through it like someone who has every right to be here. Because I do." She looked at her grandfather, 78 years old, gray shirt, polished boots, standing in a room full of people who had come because his name was finally where it belonged, holding a plate of food he hadn't touched because he'd been processing something that required the full capacity of the man he'd spent his entire life becoming, and she understood, with a clarity that had nothing to do with ceremony or documentation or institutional process, what the last 3 months had actually been about. Not the commendation, not the investigation, not even the 5 names finally in the record. It was about a man walking through a gate as himself, fully, with the weight of everything he'd carried and everything he'd done acknowledged and visible and real. Not erased, not managed, not placed on administrative hold. Present. "Next time," she said, "we'll go through the main gate together." Walter nodded. He took a bite of the sandwich. He looked at the mountains once more, briefly, and then he looked away, because the mountains were not going anywhere, and there was food to eat and people to talk to, and a room full of imperfect individuals doing the imperfect work of acknowledging something true, and that was where he was, and it was enough. It was more than enough. The gate that had turned him away was 40 yards across the frozen parade field, and it was not the last word on anything, just a gate. The last word belonged to the record, and to the people who refused to stop asking for it, and to the quiet ones who kept going when the keeping going was the only available form of courage, and to all the ways that strength announces itself not in the moment of recognition, but in the decades before it, when no one is watching and the work still gets done. The room was warm, the coffee was decent. Outside, the Wyoming winter held the mountains in clear, cold light. Emily Hale stood beside her grandfather and ate something she didn't taste and thought, this is what it looks like when something real is finished. Not clean, not perfect, not without cost, but finished and true and finally said out loud where it could not be taken back.